Hey gang, Professor McElroy here. It's about 6:30. We're in week 2, learning module 2. I want to kind of get started on time tonight. I'm going to go ahead and record the Zoom lecture. It looks like just about everyone is going to either log on synchronously or watch this later recorded asynchronously. Whatever works best for you is perfectly fine. Remember, it's graphic design 2, so we're kind of not introducing skills, we're just enhancing on skills as we kind of navigate through the software applications. So we're going to try to do about an hour and a half lecture here tonight on Adobe Illustrator. Last week was Photoshop. Good job last week with learning module 1. Remember, if you're going to be using your own images as you're kind of building the projects from the book, make sure that you're still showcasing all of the skills that are highlighted in the chapter assignment. So if you're adding an image with a mask inside of type, make sure that your image reflects that as well. Don't just do image blends and submit just the image blend. Make sure that all the parts from the step-by-step are reflected in the book assignments, even if you use your own images. If you go to pexels.com or anything like that, just make sure that you're highlighting the same process that the step-by-step in the book does. Everyone's got a pretty good grasp of pixel manipulation, image blending, the basic skills of Photoshop. So now, as we develop each of our software application skill sets, let's make sure that we're referencing professional solutions. If your out-of-book assignment is a movie poster, go out on Google and Google 2022 movie posters. See what the size of the type is, depending on which element they're highlighting on the poster. Everyone is blending images perfectly fine now. Everyone, for the most part, can cut out a clean shape and add it to another shape. No problem there with the pixels. What we're trying to replicate is the professional output of Photoshop. So if it's a horror movie poster or a scary movie poster or whatever you want to call it, make sure that the name to the movie is large towards the top of the design, like it would be in a professional poster. There's nothing wrong with Googling professional solutions to see scale, proportion, and visual hierarchy, and then taking that process and replicating it with the elements that you're creating for your finished solution. So we should see really big movie names. We should see smaller text that's left aligned or right aligned or center aligned based on your layout that describes the movie or gives a quote from the movie or something like that. And towards the bottom, there should be some kind of production house logo, some kind of movie like Sony Motion Pictures, and some of the main actors or actresses from the movie. So as we dive into out-of-book projects, let's make sure that we're referencing solutions that you think are strong solutions, right? We're deconstructing to reconstruct. So you should be getting inspiration from things that are floating around in our design abyss here. So the internet is a beautiful thing for referencing. If you're walking around one of the malls and there's a Regal Cinema and we have a poster assignment, walk by the posters on the wall and see what they look like. If you go with a friend or a girlfriend or wife or kids and you go to the movies, check out designs. Feed your brain with professional solutions. The only way you can push the envelope of your designs and continue to create effective visual solutions is to feed your brain. I am a lifelong learner. I am constantly looking at global designs. What are they designing in China? What does it look like in Spain? What is Central America creating for their logos for some of their businesses? I'm always feeding my brain with design solutions. It's teaching me color theory. It's teaching me typography. It's teaching me visual trends. Are they modern? Are they classic? Like, are most things square or circle or triangular? Like, what is happening in the world of design? And how can I make my design solutions look really strong and good for what I'm trying to create for my clients? So when we're working on both in-book and out-of-book assignments, there's nothing wrong with Googling, researching, checking out the world, see what is being creative that created that you consider to be effective visual communication and trying to replicate the layout of that particular thing. So just keep that in mind as we dive through. These are what I would consider beyond the basic skills. And now we're starting to get into a little bit more intermediate skills of each of our software applications. We get pixel ideas now. We know how to manipulate pixels. We know how to combine pictures. We got the basic idea of what we would like to do visually. We understand resolution. We have the basics of image manipulation. Now we want to make sure we continue to learn and grow as a professional solution builder, something that would be effective in the world if it was an object that was created for the world. And now we're starting to create things for the world. So we want to make sure that we're creating effective solutions. All right, so that brings us into Learning Module 2, Week 2. This week's lecture is going to be a little bit about Illustrator. Illustrator happens to be my favorite of the 20 plus Adobe programs that are in the Creative Cloud. I am an illustrator. I draw. I like to create vector graphics. I am a brand builder. Brand builder means logo designer. My logos are what are called combination marks, which means I have illustrations and text combined to create logos, which are most of the logos you see out in the world floating around today. Think about all the store logos, all the fashion logos, all of the food and restaurant logos. Everything you see out there that's brand based, most of the brands include a symbol of some kind and a word or letter mark of some kind. And those two things together, we call a combination mark. I love Adobe Illustrator. I draw in my iPad on Adobe Draw. I use Procreate. I use pen and paper that I scan in and I vectorize in Illustrator. I am an illustrator. I like to draw vector graphics. The reason I like vector graphics is because in Illustrator, you can make things look really real right now. And you can blow them up to 80 feet by 80 feet and they still look crystal clear. You can scale them down to a 1/2 inch by a 1/2 inch and they still look really clear. We call those scalable vector graphics. You can make them as big as you want or as small as you want and they're still crystal clear. Unlike Photoshop, that if your image is only 3 inch by 3 inch, you can't blow it up to 20 inch by 20 inch. It is tied to pixel ratio. Illustrator is not. It is made up of fills and strokes, shapes that have fills and strokes. And Illustrator's gotten really good at using effects to create three-dimensional realistic objects in a scalable vector world. So it is the program that I love. Adobe Illustrator for week 2 for you is basic pen tool, basic text, basic textures, and basic fills are your chapter assignments. They're not difficult this week. They are very simple in my opinion, but you have to be comfortable with vector graphics and basic drawing tools in order for Illustrator to be something you can really gravitate towards. Some designers only want to create in Photoshop. They become photo manipulating artists and they go to work and they design specifically picture-based solutions. Some artists, designers, visual communicators, only want to design in a multi-page environment. I want to go work for a magazine or a book publisher or the newspaper. I just want to create multiple page solutions. Well, those designers use InDesign and they don't really love Photoshop or Illustrator. Some designers really love illustrations and you don't have to be a drawer, quotation marks, in order to love Illustrator. You can actually draw scalable appropriate images using photographs that you draw on top of. You don't have to be an artist, quotation marks, to love Adobe Illustrator. I happen to like to draw. I've had sketch pads since I was probably 3 or 4 years old, and I probably have 200 sketch pads in my library at home of stuff I've drawn my entire life. I like to draw. It doesn't mean you have to love or like to draw, but you need to know how to use Adobe Illustrator. So this week is all about Adobe Illustrator. So we're going to do a kind of a logo drawing project for our lecture. And we're going to talk about the pen tool. We're going to look at fills and strokes and textures. We're going to look at type, how it works, text on a path, creating an outline with type, manipulating letters and type, and get the basic concept of how Illustrator works, how you manipulate pixels, quotation marks, little nodes inside the shapes, and how you create original things using Illustrator. Just remember that if you create this stuff in Illustrator, maybe you have a friend that owns a business and he needs a logo to put on the side of his vehicle, his van, his truck, or whatever it is. Well, if you create something for him in Illustrator, he can put it there. He can put it on a business card. He can put it on a billboard. He can put it on a huge graphic, a mural. Once you draw it for him or her, and it's a scalable graphic, it's a vector graphic, Illustrator or EPS file, or saved as a PDF, he or she can produce it as small as they want or as big as they want. And that's the power of Illustrator. Most students, once they start to tinker around in Illustrator a little bit, really start to love it because they see the power of what you can create with it. If you create something in Illustrator, it lasts an eternity. It is scalable. It can be huge, it can be small. It just is the ultimate design solution, in my opinion, because of its flexibility and functionality. All right, so that brings us into Illustrator. Everyone did fine with the Photoshop book. You've got 4 projects. They're probably 35 or 45 minutes each. They're not long. They're each little micro skill. Your book does a pretty good job at micro skills. I think the magazine cover, which was kind of the last project in your Photoshop chapters, is a really beautiful thing. The posters and things that your book does in Illustrator in chapter 7, 8, 10, and 11 are really beautiful too. So they're trying to teach you appropriate scalable graphics, appropriate visual scale, appropriate focal points and balance and all the basic elements of layout. So follow along and make sure that you read, absorb the terminology, and do the projects. No one's having any problem with that. Just remember to save it as a PDF. I did get a couple of weird file extensions from the Photoshop files, and I had to say, hey, can you save it as a PDF or something that I can see? Remember, every project that we do this month in this class, you can save as a PDF. File, save as PDF. It's way easier for me and should be way easier for you, including InDesign next month or next week, which is also can be saved as a PDF. Okay. So that brings us over to our lecture for today. So I'm just going to open up Illustrator first, and we're going to talk about some tools, best practices, things you should do in Illustrator. I'm going to create a new graphic. I'm going to make it up. I'm going to go over here to print, and I'm just going to choose a basic letter size piece of paper, which is 8.5 by 11. So I'm just going to switch it to inches so you can see it's 8.5 by 11. I'm going to switch it to landscape because we're going to do a little logo project where we're going to redraw and recreate a logo. And so landscape's really nice because traditionally, which you can see right down here, logos kind of have an elongated format to them because it's an illustration and text, and it's how the illustration and text interact, kind of creates sometimes elongated horizontal, sometimes elongated portrait, and sometimes square if you're lucky enough to kind of come up with a layout that is square base. Well, you're going to notice right down here, color mode is CMYK, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black color. Remember that in vector world, print world, CMYK is your color mode. In Photoshop, you're dealing with web enabled graphics. And remember, RGB is what the color calibration for your monitor is. And for the web, multimedia is RGB. Remember, 4 colors are better than 3. So CMYK is 4 color process, better than 3 color process. But you'll also notice that the raster effects setting, remember pixel-based elements, which gets into drop shadows and glows and different things you can do from an effects standpoint in Illustrator, they're tied to high resolution. So just know that the effects we add may be raster-based effects in a vector environment, but they are also high resolution, which means when we scale them up, they're really beautiful. When we scale them down, they're really beautiful. So that's what we're going to go with. Up until a couple of years ago, you only had the option of one artboard. Illustrator's gotten smart. From some standpoint, I would say smart, but from another standpoint, I'm thinking they're starting to steal some of the thunder from the other programs. You can do multiple artboards. Well, then that begs, why do you even have InDesign? Because if you can do multiple artboards in Illustrator, and you can do multiple artboards in InDesign, and InDesign is multi-page, and now Illustrator is multi-page, type is vector in Illustrator and type is vector in InDesign, you're starting to wonder why they are starting to do some of the same things in both programs. Well, know that InDesign flows text, wraps text, and does master pages way better than Illustrator. So it's still the program of choice for magazine design, interactive PDFs, menu design. If you believe there's still newspapers, newspaper design. So it's still the program of choice for multi-page, but Illustrator is getting a lot more powerful because you can do multiple artboards. Instead of pages, they call them artboards. Okay, so we're going to do create, and it's going to generate this little thing for us, right? Our little artboard here. Remember, it's horizontal or landscape because I chose that format. You should not see any trickery over here in the toolbar because a lot of this stuff you've already seen, and I lectured about it in Graphic Design 1. The select tool, the direct select tool, the pen tool, the shape tool, the paintbrush, the text, the rotation, a lot, gradient, the eyedropper, the width tool. A lot of these things we've seen from my lecture in Graphic Design 1. So we're just building upon those elements now in Graphic Design 2. And you'll also notice over here are our palettes. You should, excuse me, remember that term from Graphic Design 1. Palettes are basically a grouping of attributes or effects of the object that you have created in your artboard. They just put them over here because it's like information that you're looking for, kind of like in Word where the character palette has everything to do with font. Same scenario over here, no different. Looks the same as Photoshop for the most part. Toolbar on the left, palettes on the right-hand side, and the artboard in the middle. So now we're going to start playing around with some different elements. We're going to talk about different things as we create our own logo design, combination mark, illustration, and type inside this artboard environment. Now, I was trying to think of like, what could we create fun to draw that we could kind of play around with the tools in Illustrator that wasn't too much, but just enough to kind of start exploring the tools. And I don't know if you know Bonita Springs all that well. I like to wander around the downtown there a little bit every once in a while. It's a really nice little downtown. And they have a kayak place. And the kayak's really fun because you can kind of go through the water, I don't even know what river that is. It runs through there. I think it might be the Imperial River. And it kind of snakes through the neighborhoods and eventually will take you out to the Gulf of Mexico if you really went far enough. But there's a kayak place there that you can rent kayaks for the day. And my wife and I and my teenage boys, we've done it a few times. It's a lot of fun. But the company is in dire need of some branding help. I think the original owner probably drew the logo. The type is terrible. It's stencil font. So I thought maybe we'd play around a little bit with their logo. So I'm going to type in kayak, Bonita Springs, and it's like trying to think of the name of it. Here it is, CGT Kayaks. So CGT Kayaks is the kayak rental place in downtown Bonita. So I'm going to click on their little website right here. And you're going to notice this is their logo. First off, this is a stencil font here, which is completely boring, not memorable, just something that someone threw together in order to create their logo. This is a hand letter font. You could barely read the phone number because it's like weirdly set up here where the kerning and leading between the numbers are all awkward. See how the 8s lean that way and the 2 leans that way. And there's like a weird kerning space here and here. So it doesn't even read correctly. This was probably the original owner's sketch for, oh man, the old school paddle with the more new school paddle and kind of this ode to culture in Bonita with this mask that has kind of this painted pattern. It's okay. I think we can redraw this and I think we can choose some better typeface to make this logo a little bit better. This is their logo right here. So we're just going to take it and drag it and drop it on the desktop. Take it and drag it and drop it on the desktop. And you'll notice it is a PNG file. That is a network graphic file. And so these are really great for the web because they're compressed, they're RGB, and they upload really quickly, and they allow for transparency, which is what this thing is. It's a transparent logo, which means there's no fill color in the background. but they need a lot of help. So I think we're going to help them out a little bit and redraw this illustration and choose a little bit better typeface to kind of build the branding name that they have going on here. And secondly, if it was cool, they could make stickers and people could put them on their cars and be like, oh, we kayak in Bonita Springs and we always rent them from this place. And you're always thinking branding, branding, branding. They barely have branding. And when you actually go to rentals, it's a little shack at Riverside Park. I mean, it's like the most ridiculous thing. You don't even know where it is most of the time. I think they could make a lot more money if they were a little better in their branding of their company. So I'm going to go ahead and close that. All right, so we're going to go back into Illustrator. We've saved that thing, hopefully over to the desktop. It's right here. CGT must have been the name of the guy's initials that started this thing, or maybe it's this children's or something that they combined to do that. The name isn't memorable to begin with, so that makes it a little bit more difficult, but okay. So once we have our PNG saved to our desktop, we're going to go to File, Place, and we're going to bring our logo into Illustrator. So when we go to File, Place, and click Place, we can actually click and drag a box. So I'm going to click and drag a box that fills most of my artboard, and I'm going to let go. And you're going to notice that it places the logo, here it is, kind of in the middle of the document. Now, in Photoshop, when you place images, the layers create new layers as you place new objects in Photoshop. That is different than Illustrator. Illustrator will allow you to create everything on one layer. So if you notice over here in your layers palette, if I click on here, there is one layer. And the one layer is this logo. If I added text to this, if I drew anything with the pen tool, it would continue to add what are called sub layers on layer number one. Even though we're in Illustrator, and even though it doesn't matter and you can copy and paste things on top of each other over and over again, I really think best practice for you to remember is that layer number one is for your inspiration elements, the graphics you're bringing in that you might have to redraw, something you're using as a template, something you're going to be creating vector graphics on top of. That should be layer number one. So I'm going to double click on there and write the word graphic, just so that I know that this layer, layer number one, is my graphic layer. Now, before we go any further, I think I need to make a copy of this thing so I can have one big logo that I can draw on top of, and then just the text by itself. So I'm going to select that and do edit copy and edit paste, or Command C and Command V if you're using a Mac, Control C and Control V if you're using a PC, so that it frees up this thing and this thing separately. So we click on each one of these. Now, something that you should be looking at or be aware of is that when you select an object in Illustrator, we have what's called the Properties tab. So if I click on the little Properties tab down here, something that you should make sure is set up when you place an object, specifically a pixel-based object, something you're drawing over top of, or something you're using for inspiration, make sure that this button here says unembed, which means this image is embedded in my Illustrator file. So if I click on each one of these on my Properties tab, it should say unembed, which means it's embedded. The reason it's important to embed raster-based elements inside your Illustrator file is because once you embed it, you don't need the original PNG. I don't need the file that I grabbed from the internet anymore, because these images are actually part of my Illustrator file. They're embedded in my Illustrator file. Kind of like when you add a picture inside Word. When you put a picture inside Word, it's embedded in the Word document, which means you don't need the picture outside of the Word document anymore if you're just using the picture to illustrate something in a document that you're typing. In InDesign, you always have to have this picture because everything in InDesign is linked to the photos. So if you ever use InDesign before, this file is linked to the InDesign file. So if I trash that file, when I open up my InDesign file, I'm going to get a big empty X box inside my document because it can't find the picture anymore. Photoshop, the image is embedded. Illustrator, you can embed the image by placing it and making sure in the properties window, it says unembed, which means it is already embedded. If you click on this and click on the properties and this button says embed, you need to click on that because you need to put that thing in the document so you don't have to keep the photos from outside of the document anymore. That's how you keep file management inside your computer, so you don't have a duplicate and triples and quadruples of the same image saved all over the place in your computer. You embed it in the file, and then you only have to have it in one place. And remember, we're using it as a template, so we don't have to keep the other thing because we're just using it to kind of draw over the top of. Okay, so now I need to separate the illustration or the symbol of this logo from the text. So we need to make a clipping mask. We need to cut out the elements that we want to use as a template so that we can separate the things so we have a little better ability to kind of draw and create them. And so I do a lot of that in Illustrator. I just make clipping masks. So I'm going to take the rectangular shape tool and I'm going to draw a rectangle over just the text. So I'm going to draw a rectangle over just the text. Now, best practice in Illustrator is whenever you create an object, draw with a rectangle tool, use the pen tool, use the text tool, use the paintbrush tool, any of the tools. When you're done creating the shape that you want to create with that tool, go back to the selection arrow, which is the black arrow. Always go back to the selection arrow, because if you don't, you're going to be thinking, I just want to select the shape I drew, but you'll end up drawing another rectangle, another rectangle, another rectangle. Best practice, always go back to the selection tool after you create the vector object you need to create in the step you're doing in Illustrator. That way, you're always selecting or deselecting after you create the shape that you need. So once I have it drawn, I go back to my selection tool. I'm going to make sure I select the box, hold down Shift, and select the logo. So hold down Shift and select the logo. So in essence, I selected both things. You can actually use your selection arrow outside of your document and click and draw a selection box. So if you just use your selection arrow and you click from outside the object and draw just over the two objects, it'll do the same thing. So you can click on one, hold down Shift, click on the other. You can click and drag from outside of the object and select both things. You'll notice I kept the things away from each other because it's really easy to select everything. So I try to keep the things I want to group together kind of close together so I can click and drag. Once I select the two objects I want to select so that they're both selected, right? So this thing is called a bounding box. The bounding box should be over both objects, the rectangle we drew and the logo that we placed. So we have both these things selected. Now, something you should know about Adobe. When in doubt, right click. Everything is embedded as menus in Adobe. So if you're like confused in Photoshop, just right click and it's going to tell you what they think you want to do next. They kind of try to embed the best, most used practices that a designer will use based on what is selected in the artboard or what is selected in the page. So if I have these two things selected and I right click, you're going to notice it gives you a few options that it thinks you want to do based on what you have selected in the artboard. And you're going to notice this thing called a clipping mask right down here. And it's going to say, hey, do you want to make a clipping mask? Yes, actually I do. So I'm going to click make clipping mask. And you're going to notice that it's going to cut a window out of only where I drew the rectangle. That's called a clipping mask. So it's cutting out only the part of the image that I want visible based on the shape I drew over the image. So now you'll notice that the text is all by itself, right? Text is all by itself. Is the symbol mark over here still there? Absolutely. It's just hidden because the only thing that's visible is the little rectangle we drew. If I drew a rectangle just over this and selected both the text and the shape, then I'll only get the symbol. And that's exactly what I want to do. So I'm going to go back to my rectangle tool and I'm going to draw a rectangle over just the symbol, what we call the symbol mark or the illustration. So I'm going to draw a rectangle just over that so that I have, in essence, drawn a shape over top of that. Once I've done that, remember, back to the selection arrow. I want to go back to the selection arrow because I need to select the shape, hold down Shift, and select the logo, right? Same scenario we did up here. And watch when I mouse over. Look at what's happening. You can actually see the image is bigger than what you can see, right? So I know that the image continues all the way over here. I've just cut it out because I made a clipping mask. So we're going to do the same thing here. So I'm going to right click and do make clipping mask. And you're going to notice the only thing that's visible is the symbol. The reason I did that was because we're going to use these elements as like a template to draw over the top of. And we need to separate those things so I can make this a little bit bigger. I need this image to be a little bit bigger so I can draw over the top of it and see the details a little bit better. Remember, this is pixel based. So as I make it bigger inside of Illustrator, it is going to distort a little bit because remember when I did File New, it said the effects would be 300 DPI. Well, when you make an image bigger in Illustrator, if it is pixel based, you get the same effect process as when you make something bigger in Photoshop. It gets blurry, but that's okay for us because in Illustrator, we're using the photo just as a template to draw all over the top of. So it doesn't matter as much that it's blurring as long as we can see the shapes because we're going to be making them vector anyway, which will make them scalable. Now, inside of our rotation tool is our scale tool, right? Here is our scale tool. So if I double click on my scale tool with the symbol selected, it'll actually allow me to scale it proportionately bigger. So let's try to make it 150. And you'll notice when you make it 150, it is a little blurry. It's not as clear as it was before. So I selected the symbol that has the clipping mask and I double clicked on the scale tool. So you can actually go into the rotation tool and change it to scale. Move your mouse over here and then double click on that and you can make it uniformly bigger, which means it will scale it proportionately. Never do non-uniform. I always tell the students, never do non-uniform because that's going to make your golden retriever look like a wiener dog, like it's going to distort it. So we don't want to distort it. If we're making things bigger and smaller in any of our design programs, we want to make sure we scale proportionately, which means if we're using just a selection arrow, we want to hold down Shift so it scales it proportionately. If we're using a scale menu, we want to make sure that we choose uniform. Make sure you don't stretch it. This is what happens if you stretch it. So you see, if I just take the move tool and I do that, that's scaling it non-uniform. And look how distorted it is. It isn't scaled proportionately. We want to make sure it's scaled proportionately. So now you'll notice we've got a bigger mask and we have the text below it. I only did that because actually a true logo should have a visual balance between the size and boldness of the illustration and the size and boldness of the text. It doesn't mean these two things have to be exactly the same size, but you want to make sure if you've got heavy dark type that you have a pretty big illustration because by nature, the heavy dark type will overpower the illustration. So if you're using really dainty, kind of thin type like this, then you can go with a lighter or smaller illustration because they'll balance themselves visually. If you use bold type, you need to have a scale appropriate illustration so they feel visually the same size. It doesn't mean they're actually the same size. It just means that the visual weight, how intense the object is when you're looking at it, seems equally the same. So if you have like heavy drop shadows or heavy glows on something, you want to make sure you have type that has some thickness to it because the glows and the shadows are really going to draw your attention. And that means the type will just disappear unless the type has a little bit of weight to it. So if the illustration is detailed and heavy and bold, you want to make sure your type is a little bit bigger and bold. If your illustration is like a dainty drawing of a butterfly and it's kind of like an outline and a sketch, then you can go with a lighter typeface because the illustration is a soft sketch and the type will match its visual intensity by not being so bold. If you have bold type, you probably don't want just a pencil drawing of the illustration because the type will over dominate the illustration and you won't really pay attention to the illustration because the letters are so heavy visually. So that's kind of how you judge it. So immediately this is already better because the one on the website has this over here, this is much smaller, and your eye goes to the name and it never looks at the illustration. But honestly, the illustration's kind of cool. Like it's pretty neat what they did. So why would you want to overpower that by having really heavy type and a mask that's really small and dainty? And actually the sign on the building, they used to have a building sign in Bonita. This was as big as this and it was put over the top of it. So why they separated it, I don't have any idea, but we're going to recreate this thing and we might choose some better typeface too, because their typeface isn't that good. Okay. So now that we have the elements that we're being inspired by. So think about Illustrator. Maybe you know someone that owns a business and maybe it's a bakery and they want to have a loaf of bread or a muffin or something in their logo. And they just want the name of their bakery underneath and they want a little illustration of some bread or something. Think about Illustrator. You can have a really nice photo of bread that's been sliced a little bit and you can save it to the desktop and you can file place it in Illustrator. Do you need to know the scale and proportion of the bread? No, because you have the picture that shows you the scale and proportion of the bread. What I know how small the eyes are, how small the mouth is, how big the nose is, the color pattern of this mask, the unique shape of this or the unique shape of this or just from my brain? No. So getting inspiration by finding image resources to kind of be inspired by is okay. It teaches you scale and proportion. I'm not great at drawing figures, human bodies. I'm not great at the scale of animals, but I can go out and find a photo of a tiger and draw it with my pen tool in Illustrator for scale and proportion, but give it my own personality as I'm kind of drawing and outlining it. And it looks great because it's scaled appropriately, but it's my own unique art drawing of it on top of it. You don't have to be someone who can just think with their brain, pull out a piece of paper and make a beautiful drawing. There's tons of inspiration out there. There's tons of resources out there, but you have to know how to put your own personality into it so it becomes your unique thing. But there's no reason that you can't use objects as inspiration. When I was in school many moons ago, I had to take a figure drawing class. You know what I used? I used a wooden figurine that they sell at stores where you can bend the arms and move the head and move the legs. And that taught me proportion. 8 heads equal a body. I, in my brain, couldn't just close my eyes and draw a perfect figure with the appropriate waist and legs and arms and chest and everything. And you see people on YouTube all the time, they sketch wireframes, a triangle for the torso, they draw a line, they draw the spine, they draw the neck, then they draw the head so it can wiggle. They draw the joints, what we call the skeleton, but they do it based on figurines and models. Like Disney animators, they actually create 3D figurines of the characters they have to draw, and they have armatures and they move the figurines and they look at the figurine and draw it on the screen. They just can't do it with their brain perfectly scaled all the time. So just know Illustrator is for scalable graphics, but you can use photographs and raster-based images to help you with scale and proportion. You're just drawing over the top of it and giving your own perspective. So I'm going to go ahead and take these 2 objects. I'm just going to draw a big selection box. I'm going to take the 2 objects and I'm going to kind of put it in the middle of the page. So all I'm doing is putting it in the middle of the page because I'm going to use this as a template for our drawing process. So we're just using the photo as a template for our drawing process. If this was already appropriately scaled, I wouldn't have to do a clipping mask and make two objects of the image. I would just place the image in the middle of the page and make it big enough that I could draw over the top of it. Now, once I have these objects kind of placed in the center, remember, this is all my graphic layer. So there's only one layer right now called the graphic layer. So we're going to go ahead and add another layer. So I'm going to hit the little plus symbol down here and add another layer, and you should get layer number 2. So best practices in Illustrator, even though you can do everything on one layer, is to have a graphic layer and a vector layer, So I know that the graphic layer is where my elements of inspiration are. The pictures I'm using to kind of help me scale and proportion and draw and create, right? Somebody contacts me and they want for me to create a logo for maybe a winery, right? I know wine, I drink it with my wife. I'm just made of grapes, I get it. But I don't know scale and proportion grapevines all that well. I don't know grape bunches. I think they call them bunches all that well. So if I had a graphic layer I was using to create a logo for a winery, I would place a photo of grapes. So I would put a photo of grapes right here so that I would have some inspiration to create the circles I need, to create the bunch of grapes I need. I could take a circle tool and make a basic, start with 5 circles, go to 4 circles, go to 3 circles, go to 2 circles, go to 1 circle, and triangularly make a bunch of grapes. I mean, I could do that, but maybe I want it to overlap a little bit, look a little more realistic. So I'll use a photo of grapes, a bunch of grapes, and then draw over the top of it to help me create the inspiration of the grapes I'm using for my winery logo I'm creating. So just know that the graphic layer is specifically to place your inspirational elements, your photographic elements that you're using to create scale and proportion. You're using to create things. Okay, so the graphic elements are our inspiration. So once we have those all on one layer, we want to lock the layer, right? So if I drag my selection box over the top now, I can't select the graphics. They're locked. Well, that's really important because now that I'm on the vector layer, I want to create things like first the mask. So I want to kind of outline it or draw it. And then I'm going to create the oars next. So mask first, and then maybe oars. And the reason I'm separating the elements, and I'm actually going to draw the handle all the way across here when I draw it, because I actually think the mask should be a little bit bigger so that it doesn't elongate the illustration. This is called negative space, empty negative space. So if the oars are too long, and I get it, when you kayak, the oar's really long because you got to be able to paddle the boat. But from a logo standpoint, the mask should be like this big, so that, think of like a skull and crossbones, right? For the poison symbol, the skull is almost as big as the crossbones. There isn't a lot of extra negative space that stretches the bones out. Everything is pretty compact. The reason that is because if I take a box and I'm just going to draw and hold it, you don't have to do this, but I'm just going to use it as a reference point. If I let that go, and I'm going to switch so that it's a stroke, not a fill, so you can actually see it. Look at all the negative space. So you see this here, this here, this here, this here, all this space down here, and this space over here. That's called negative space. When you elongate an illustration, which means this oar goes all the way over here, this oar goes all the way over here, and the mask is real small in the middle here. Look at all the unused space that's part of the logo, because it's your eye has to draw a little invisible box around this as it's looking at it. You want to minimize all of this negative space. So really the mask needs to be bigger so that there's less empty space here and here. It kind of makes it more dominant, more compact. Think of it like a stamp, right? A stamp is real small. You want to make sure everything in the stamp is like square, compact, so it fills the negative space of the stamp. If this was a stamp, it would be a terrible one because there's so much negative space at the top and the bottom. In order to make it fit on the stamp, you would have to shrink this thing down. to the maximum width and the maximum height of this thing, and it would make the mask really, really tiny. So from a thinking process, I think we need to make the mask bigger, but we got to kind of draw it first. So I'm going to do Command plus, and I'm just going to zoom in a little bit. And if you know anything about Illustrator, if you hold the space bar down when you have the selection arrow selected, if you hold the space bar down, it turns into a hand, and you can actually just move your document around the page. That's the best short key, or one of them, you'll ever use inside Illustrator. Because if you hold the space bar down, you can move to different areas of your design by just clicking and dragging. Well, when you're drawing, you want to be in close so that you can see all the shapes. So you really should try to zoom in and then hold the space bar down and pan around. So we're actually going to zoom in, hold the space bar down, and center the mask in the middle of our page, because we have to draw the mask and then we have to draw all the shapes inside the mask, right? So we've got to draw this thing. So once I have it zoomed in, I'm going to minimize my palette. So I'm going to hit the little double lines right here, and I'm going to minimize it. The reason I minimize it is because I want to maximize my surface area, what I can actually see in my design. And I always like to center it and tuck all the palettes, what we call tuck the palettes, which means move them all hidden over here so you have the maximum space for the artboard. Now, the most important tool in all of Illustrator is the pen tool, this little tool right here. Practicing the pen tool and at least getting somewhat comfortable with the pen tool is the key to Illustrator dominance, because the pen tool allows you to create complete shapes that are asymmetric or ill-formed in any kind of shape you want to draw, right? But you also have to think and remember that when you're drawing in Illustrator, you're starting in outline form, which means no color inside of the shape, just the outline of the shape. So think of it like a coloring book. You color the outline first to create the coloring book, and then when you sell the coloring book, everyone colors in the shapes. In Illustrator, it's best to work in outline, draw everything in outline, and then add color later once you have the outlines created. Do not draw with fills inside of your shapes, because every time you start to create a shape, it will cover up some part of the image that you want to draw, right? So if this was my pen tool, and you don't have to do this, just watch what I'm doing. If I was drawing with a fill and I wanted to draw, let's say, this mask, and I'm going to go back and do it the right way, but look at what's going to happen. See how it's covering up the image? I can't see parts of the image. So even though I kind of know the shape of the mask and I can do that, I need to draw like this. So I'm just going to make it a black stroke so you can see, right? So as I'm creating the shapes I need to create, so I'm just going to do this one real quick. You don't have to do it with me. I'm just starting the drawing process, right? As I'm creating this shape, I can still see the shape inside of it. So when you're drawing in Illustrator, it is best practice to A, have a graphic layer, something you can draw on top of as inspiration as you learn to draw, and B, draw in outline only. Do not draw with colors inside the shape, which is called fill, which is what this little icon is, because it will color up. It will cover up your inspiration, what you're trying to draw on top of. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that shape. So what I like to do is I like to default to no fill and a black stroke. So that is my default. It's just like I was drawing in my sketchbook. No fill, black stroke. And you can double click on the stroke and either pick black by dragging all the way down to the corner, or you can go to the color palette, which is over here, and click on that and choose the black swatch from the stroke, however you want to do it, which is 0 cyan, 0 magenta, 0 yellow, and 100% black. That's what those CMYK settings are. And you should kind of know a thing or two about CMYK, because that's how they mix paint at the hardware store. If you go and you want a color that you're going to paint on your walls and you give them the little swatch from the paint wall of swatches, they flip it over and they look at the cyan, magenta, yellow, and black percentages. And all they do on the machine is type in 10% cyan, 10% magenta, 0% yellow, and 50% black. And all of a sudden you have dark blue. I mean, that's how they do it. So it's the same scenario in Illustrator. It's just a percentage of cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. Color theory, the color wheel, the color spectrum, which is what that is called. This thing here is called the color spectrum. Roy G. Biv, right? Roy G. Biv. And that's how we pick percentages of cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. And that equals to the color that you're trying to create inside of your fill or stroke. Okay. So no fill, black stroke. And we're going to draw just like we were drawing in a sketchbook, just like we were drawing on a piece of paper. Nowadays, just like we were drawing on an iPad. I have an iPad Pro, I have an Apple Pencil, and I draw my vector graphics on my iPad. Actually, if I'm creating a logo or an illustration for someone, I do the entire thing on my iPad now. I don't even use Illustrator because Adobe Draw is Adobe Illustrator for the iPad. Now they call it Fresca. I think they renamed it. I actually still have the original app called Adobe Draw. So when I draw with my pencil on the glass of my iPad, so it's just like drawing on a piece of paper, it's a digital vector graphic, which means I can actually share my drawing from my iPad directly to Illustrator. And then I could open up an Illustrator and fill the shapes. So I actually draw the outline on my iPad and I color it in on Illustrator. Well, that's awesome because I can take a picture of whatever, a panda, put it in my iPad, put it in Adobe Draw, use my pencil and literally trace the photograph with my pencil in Adobe Draw, remove the photograph from my document on my iPad. So all I have is the sketch left. So it was like tracing it. It was literally like tracing the panda photograph, saving it, and it shares it from my iPad to Illustrator through the cloud, or I can save it to my profile, my Adobe CC profile, and I can open it up on Illustrator, and it'll be a perfect digital sketch as if I knew exactly all the scale and proportions and stripes and stuff of the panda. So I used the photograph, I traced it with my pencil on my iPad, I saved only the trace part of the image on my iPad, opened it up in Illustrator, and I had a completely sketched out panda that I could add color to. So technology has gotten really great. So if you aren't 100% loving the mouse technique for drawing, we used to have to use a Wacom tablet to draw, which means draw on this little tablet over here and it appears on the screen. Now you can do it on an iPad. And you can get an iPad for a couple $100 that allows you to use the pencil. I mean, it's really scary. And it's cheaper than a Wacom tablet ever was, or Wacom tablet, however you want to pronounce it. Those were like $700. Now for a couple $100, you can get a little small iPad and you can draw on Adobe Draw and save it to Illustrator. And it's way cheaper than, I think they put them out of business. People don't even buy the separate tablets anymore. They just draw on their tablet and save it to the program to open it up again. So when I draw illustrations lots of times now, I literally draw on my iPad, save it as an Illustrator file, open it up on my iMac that I have in my office and fill it in right there. I mean, it's amazing. So I don't have to draw on paper anymore, scan the paper in, go into Illustrator, draw on top of the scan that I drew on a piece of paper. I can do it all by tracing it, in essence, on my iPad. And we're going to trace this. So we're doing the same process. The only difference is we're using a mouse and the pen tool versus using an Apple Pencil. Or if you have a Samsung Galaxy, they call it a stylus. You can do the same thing on a Samsung Galaxy or any of the PC-based tablets. If they have a tablet and they have a stylus, pressurized stylus, you can do the same thing. You can open up Illustrator on a Samsung Galaxy and do the exact same process. So technology has evolved, but we're doing the same thing. So we're going to use our mouse and the pen tool and do the same thing I now do on my iPad. I can do a little quicker on my iPad because I'm tracing it. It's like a pencil on top of an image. I just trace it with my pencil and it creates a complete shape. and I don't have to use click and drag, click and drag, click and drag, which is what the pen tool is. So it does make it a little quicker, a little easier, and it allows me, because I'm using the pencil, the Apple Pencil, I can make the lines not perfect. I can make my own personality. So I don't have to follow the image perfectly. I can actually go outside the shape a little bit because I'm creating my own kind of personality based on the image that I'm using for scale and proportion. And that's how a lot of artists do it. They'll actually take a picture of a tiger, but as they're chasing the ears, they may misshape them a little bit, curve them a little bit. They might change the stripe pattern. They use the photo to see the thickness of the stripes, but they might change the pattern on them when they're drawing them to give them their own personality. So there's lots of technologies now. So even if you don't love drawing, anyone can trace. Anyone can trace. It just takes a little practice to trace, but anyone can trace. We're actually going to make the exact same pattern that's on this mask using the pen tool, and we're just going to trace the shapes. That's all we're going to do. So we're going to trace the outline. We're going to trace each one of these blue shapes. We're going to trace this blue shape down here. We're going to trace the two shapes that make the mouth, the three circles that make the eyes, and the little shapes that make these red things. So we're going to do the exact same thing that the artist did painting this thing. The only difference is we're going to use the pen tool and trace over the top of it. Remembering that the graphics are on the graphic layer and the illustration, the thing we're drawing, is on the vector layer. Okay, so we're going to create this thing now using our pen tool. So let's switch to the pen tool, the standard old pen tool. We used it in Graphic Design 1 class. I know it's tricky, the Bezier curves, the pull and the drag. It's a little to get used to, but now in Graphic Design 2, we should be practicing a little bit more with it. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to make sure there's no fill and there's a stroke of some dark color. I prefer black. Some artists draw with dark gray, like as if a pencil was drawing it. Some use a blue or a purple or a red. It's really just what your preference is. But I spent my life drawing in a sketch pad with a ballpoint pen, a black pen. And so I use black as the stroke. Now, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create the outer shape of the mask, and then we're going to start creating each one of these inner shapes. Remember, we're drawing the mask, and then we're going to draw each of the oars because we want to make the mask bigger. Like we want to make the mask bigger so the logo is bigger. So I'm going to just take my mouse and I'm going to move to the upper left-hand corner of the mask. I'm going to click once and let go. And by clicking once and let go, you're going to notice it puts what's called a node, right? A node is the starting point to the line. So once I click and let go, if I move my mouse, the mouse will actually show the type of line that's going to be created when I click my next node. Remember, shapes are made of nodes. Our trick is we want to draw the shapes with the least number of nodes. We could click, 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 all the way along this thing. Watch. I could literally click along this thing and try to follow the mask, right? And I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 nodes to draw the top part of that mask. Well, that's really not best practice. I should be able to do it in 2 nodes. So if I move my mouse over to the other end of the mask, see where it is right here, and I click and hold my mouse down and pull, this is called a directional anchor. So as I pull away from the mask diagonally to the southeast part of the design, so you see it out here, I still have my mouse held. You see how the line is curving along the top of the mask? We want to create one line segment that covers the entire top curve of the mask. So once I pull and drag to where I want the line to go, I'm going to let go. And you'll notice that the top part of the mask has been created. But look what happened. And this is a problem. Look as I move my mask down for my next point. See how it curves outside of the mask? The reason it curves outside the mask is because the forward directional anchor of this thing is really long, right? So a best practice for learning how to draw in Illustrator is to move your mouse back to the middle point, which is called the anchor point. And you're going to notice a reverse V that appears below the pen. See that little reverse V that appears below the pen? If I click my mouse once I get that reverse V, look what happened. It removed the forward directional. So watch what happens. If I move now, I can make a straight line. See how this thing is straight? It's no longer curving way out. Well, that's important because if I go to the bottom of the chin and click and hold my mouse down and pull southwest. So if I pull my mouse southwest, look at how the curve is now following the appropriate curve of the mask. So I'm able to pull and drag. Look at this thing. My line. So once I have it curved about the shape of the right side of the mask that I want, I'm going to let my mouse go. I'm going to let my mouse go. But if I move my mouse up, look at how it's curving really wide again, right? It wants me to curve that line way outside of the shape. Well, that doesn't work for me. So I'm going to move back to the center dot and get that reverse V again. So at the bottom of the mask, I'm going to get that reverse V again. There it is right there, reverse V. If I click my mouse once, it gets rid of that directional anchor. So I'm going to click and let go. So that allows me to now move to the upper left corner of the outline of the mask, right? Where the original dot started. That original dot started. I'm going to move my mouse up to the original dot. And you'll notice when you move your mouse up to the original first dot, you get a white circle. The white circle means, do you want to close the shape? Do you want to make this one solid shape, right? So when I curved this line, I went back to the middle and I removed the forward anchor. So now when I move up to the circle to close the shape, I can click and drag north and let go. And look, I made a complete shape around the curve of the mask. And I did it with only 3 nodes. That's really important. I could have traced this thing by going click, 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 all the way around the shape. But the fewer the nodes, the easier it is to manipulate the shape if I need to. The more the nodes I have to select if I want to manipulate it. If I don't like this curve and there's a bunch of points along that curve, I have to select all those points in order to manipulate the shape. If there's only one point, I only have to select one point to manipulate that part of the shape. So with 3 points, I was able to draw the outline of the shape. So just to give you, I'm going to do this real quick up here, but don't do it at home. Watch if I click my mouse a million times, right? I can create shapes by clicking my mouse a million times. I can actually click and curve a million times, right? But it's really hard to make a shape when you A, put a lot of nodes, or B, you click and drag a bunch of nodes to make the shapes. So I'm going to delete this. But if I need to make curves, look how easy it is to click and drag, go back to the center node, remove it, click and drag, go back to the center node, remove it, click and drag, go back to the center node, remove it, click and drag, go back to the center node and remove it. Removing the forward anchors makes it easier to draw a shape that is asymmetric or kind of morphed in shape, because you can take each part of the image and break it down to one curve. So you break it to a curve, you remove the forward anchor, you break it to the next curve. So you're not trying to do really big curvy shapes that you can't control the next line because it has a really long anchor. If it has a really long anchor, it makes it hard to control where the next line is going to start curving and going. Now, I've been drawing with the pen tool for like 28 years. So I can draw multiple curved lines really well without removing the forward anchor. But for students learning, the best way to learn how to use the pen tool is to remove the forward anchor when you're drawing with the pen tool, because it's more controlling, because you're only worrying about the line you're drawing, not the line that's next, right? People like GPS on their car because it tells them turn by turn. So you don't have to worry about the next turn, because when you get to the next turn, the GPS tells you the turn. It's the same with the pen tool. You only have to worry about drawing the line you're trying to draw if you remove the forward anchor, because it stops right at that point, and then you can start drawing a new line any way you want to. So it just makes drawing the pen tool a little bit easier if you remove the forward anchor. So you can place as many coloring book images, illustrations, cartoons, photographs in Illustrator and just draw over the top of them for practice. If you want to just practice the pen tool, go find an image of SpongeBob, place the image in Illustrator, save it as the graphics layer, add a vector layer on top of it, and try to trace the cartoon. Try to trace the cartoon, the little holes that make up the sponge of his body, try to make the little jagged outside shape, put his pants on, like try to trace him using the pen tool and use SpongeBob just as a template. That's the best way to practice the pen tool, is to practice tracing objects. The best objects to trace are cartoons and illustrations, because they're already made up of fills and strokes. The reason cartoons are so great is because they can make them 3D objects. They can print them on bedspreads for little kids. They can do coloring books. They can make stickers. They're all vector graphics that are made of fills and strokes, in essence. So a lot of times with students in Graphic Design 1, I'll put an Illustrator file with a coloring book image as a background, as the graphic layer, and I'll lock the layer and give them the Illustrator file with the graphic layer locked and the vector layer empty. And I tell them with the pen tool in black only outline, trace the character. And if you can trace the character, you get practice with the pen tool, which is really important when you're trying to manipulate drawings. You don't have to know how to draw, but you do have to get comfortable using a drawing tool in Illustrator. And the best one really is the pen tool, because it allows you to create completely closed shapes that we later can add color to. Because when they're completely closed shapes, they can have fills and strokes. So think about Illustrator as a bunch of shapes, closed, completed shapes that have fills and strokes. It's just like a coloring book. The outlines are the strokes, and you're using the color pencil to make the fill. It's the same concept. The only difference is we're doing the stroke and the fill together. So we're trying to make shapes that have a stroke and a fill together. That's the only difference. And so now we have the outline drawn. Now we need to create each of the shapes in here. So we have eyes. We have this little weird shape on the forehead. We've got these little shapes that look like rays. I like to start with the main objects. So like we have eyeballs, a mouth, a nose, and these little stripes on the forehead. Those are the ones I'm going to start with. So we could draw the shapes a lot of different ways. But you should recognize in Illustrator that we have shapes inside of our shape tool. And we should also recognize that the eyes and the mouth are pretty much circles, right? They're pretty much circles. So I could use the pen tool and draw each one of these shapes, but why would I when I have an ellipse tool or a circle tool that will allow me to draw the shapes? So if you know anything about the circle tool, it draws in a rectangle, a box. So that corner, which is called 0, 0, X and Y coordinate, is where the drawing starts, even though it's an ellipse and the line starts down here, right? So the bounding box, the box shape of the ellipse, is the greatest width by the greatest height. It just happens to have negative space here because it's a circle, not a square, right? So when we're drawing with the ellipse tool, we've got to think of this. And I'm actually going to zoom in a little bit more so you can see it. We have to start drawing the circle actually up here in this corner, where the top of the width meets the height of the side, right? So if I use my ellipse tool, see my cursor right here? I'm actually starting at the top height and the width so that I can draw the appropriate shape. So maximum height by maximum width. And the way I like to do it is I'm going to draw the outside circle first on both eyeballs before I draw the inside circles. So now I'm going to go to this one. I'm going to click and drag. And so now you'll see, and I'm actually just going to hide the graphic layer from it. Now you're going to see that I drew just the outside circle, right? So if I hide my graphic layer, you can see that I've just drawn the outside circle. And so I need to draw the outside circle. See when I hide the graphic? That's all I've created so far. The outline of the mask and the outside of the eyeball. So I need the ellipse tool and I got to draw the inside white circle next. And the inside black circle after that. And I'm actually going to hide the graphic layer so you can see what I've drawn so far, right? I'm going to hide the graphic layer. And that's all I've created so far, just so that you can get an idea or a gist of what my shapes look like. I've just created in essence, the beginning shapes of my eyeballs. So yours should look something like this. So we just have the basic shapes of the eyeballs and the mask, and we're just drawing it in outline form. So you can see the general shape of the outside circle, the medium circle, and then the inside circle. So we're just doing a basic trace using our shape tools to create the appropriate outline, because eventually I want to hide that and I want to have all my shapes created as outlines inside there. So next is the mouth. So let's do the mouth next. I'm going to click and drag a big circle for the white. I'm going to click and drag a slightly smaller circle. And so now I have something that looks a little more like that. So that's all I've done so far. And so we have the eyeballs, we have the mouth done. So we got the basics going on here. Now, I think I'm going to do just the basic shape of the nose here, because that's a pretty big shape. So it'll kind of give me an idea of, what I'm doing next. So I'm going to use my pen tool and I'm just going to draw what the nose looks like. It's triangular. So you'll notice I just have the beginnings of this mask. I'll worry about the overlaps and everything later. So the actual triangle kind of goes over the eyeball a little bit. And I know it goes over the eyeball a little bit, but I'm going to fix that when I do my fills and strokes for my shapes. I'm just doing the outline so you can get the basic gist of the mask. And I'm actually going to break the shapes that form the nose into two shapes. So one is a stripe that goes down the middle of the nose, which I can see right here. And the next is like a little triangle at the bottom of the nose. So I think I'll use the pen tool to draw both the stripe. So I'm just going to make a stripe. So I just made a stripe with my pen tool down the middle of the nose. And remember, go back to the selection arrow once you draw that stripe so that you can deselect, right? Because these are separate shapes. I want to draw a little triangle at the bottom of the nose next. So stripe first and then triangle at the bottom next. I'm going to go back to my pen tool and I'm just going to make this little triangular thing it's got going on here. It's got some kind of triangle at the bottom of this nose. So there's what it looks like. I just have a little triangle I use for my pen tool, and I use the line segment tool to just draw this little line here. All right, so it looks a little something like that. Looks a little quirky, but that's because it's an outline only. We haven't added any colors or anything to it. All right. And so once I have the eyeballs, the nose, and the mouth, now I'm going to start taking the bigger shapes. So you're going to notice there's blue shapes up here. There's a gold shape down here, and there's a blue shape down here. So I'm going to use the pen tool, and I'm going to start with the shapes on the forehead. So they look like triangles to me. So I'm just going to use the pen tool. Click, 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 click. And then the next one, and I'm going to make them closed shapes, which means I'm going to go from the start all the way to the end of the shape. And it should look something like that. So I'm just creating the basic shapes. I think this is a Calusa mask. The Calusa Indians, I think, is what the mask is based on, but. And so I'm just creating the basic shapes of the mask. So I'm going to start with the blue triangles at the top, which is right there. I'm going to do the gold shape across the mask next. So I drew that curve. I went back to the directional anchor. I drew the next curve, back to the directional anchor. Drew the next curve. And now you're going to see this thing starting to take shape. So I have that gold shape. This is the blue shape down here. So you can really start to see how this thing is taking shape. And this is practice, like the pen tool is practice. And so now I have the gold stripe. I have the blue shape where the lips are. The eyeballs, the nose, the mouth. And now the last thing I have to do are these weird red shapes. Now, the red shapes are interesting because the ones around the eyes are just straight lines. They're like sun rays. They're just straight lines. So we can use either. So here's what it looks like so far. Here's the shape for the gold. Here's the shape for the blue. Here's my lips. Here are my eyeballs, my nose with the triangle, the 3 blue triangles, shapes for the top. And the last, I need to do the red. So the red is a couple of options. These are either a pen line or a line segment line. Pen line or line segment line. I prefer the pen line just because I can click my mouse here and click my mouse here, and I've in essence created the red line. So if I go back to my selection arrow and deselect, there's the first line, right? There's the first line. The difference with the pen tool is that I can actually make this line thicker, which is actually what I'm going to do. I'm going to go in and make sure that my stroke palette is open, which is right here. And I'm going to make the line thicker. So you see how I just make the line thicker? So now look at what it looks like. Now it's the beginning of that red line. So I'm going to do that with my pen tool. I'm just going to make each one of the shapes a stroke. Go to deselect, go back to my pen tool, draw the next one, deselect, go back to my pen tool, draw my next one, deselect, go back to my pen tool, draw my next one. So I'm going to draw each one of the lines of the red shapes. I like to go back to the selection arrow and deselect every time I draw a line, just to make sure that I don't draw more lines than I want. And you're going to notice when I hide the graphic, I'm starting to get the patterns of the mask. So I'm starting to get the patterns of the mask. And the last shape I have to create is this weird red shape that is on the forehead. It's a weird blob shape. I'm going to have to use my pen tool for that. I'm going to have to use my pen tool for that. And this is just practice. The thing with the pen tool is it's practice, because it draws its own unique shapes. So you'll notice this is what my mask looks like. It's just outlines, but I'm using the proportions of everything to make sure that I get the correct kind of pattern of this thing. So that's what it looks like. I'm just creating my own shapes to mimic that. Now, when you're drawing over something that is pixel based, one of the really cool things is that you can use the eyedropper to kind of sample the colors of the image that you're using. So I'm actually going to use the eyedropper to color in my mask based on the shapes of the image colors that are the template of what I'm doing. So now that I have the basic mask drawn, and there it is, basic mask drawing, I'm going to fill it in. I'm going to fill in my mask now. So the first thing I'm going to do is fill in my eyeballs. So I'm going to pick the outside eyeball and I'm going to make it black. I'm going to pick the next shape, which is that one, and make it white. And then I'm going to pick the last one and make it black. And I'm going to do the same thing for the other one. Black small dot, white medium dot, black big dot. And the mouth is opposite. White, big circle, black, small circle. And so look at what it looks like now. I'm starting to color it in based on the image, right? The image. Now, the colors of the image can actually be sampled from the image itself. So watch when I pick the shape for the gold stripe. I'm going to click on the shape of the gold stripe. I can use my eyedropper, which is right over here in the color palette. So I'm going to pick the eyedropper and I'm going to click my mouse on the gold of the color. Click my mouse on the gold of the color. So it'll actually turn the shape gold. So I've sampled right out of the photograph. I sampled it right out of the photograph by using the eyedropper. So if I click on the blue, I can click on the blue shape. And so I'm going to fill this thing in a little bit. Now, the last part of the coloring process of the shapes is that we have to organize the shapes from background to foreground. So you'll notice when I clicked on this shape and used the eyedropper to sample the color that was behind it, the shape actually went on top of the nose. It went on top of the nose. So what I have to do is I have to click on the shape and right click on it and say, arrange, send to back. And you'll notice that it goes under the nose. So if I click on the next shape and right click on it and do send to back, you're going to notice the mouth appears on top of it. So if I click on it and do arrange, send to back, the mouth appears on top of it. So look at what's happening. All it's doing is reorganizing these shapes from background to foreground. So you see the little two shapes I filled in, they're all the way at the bottom. So I just was changing the order of those shapes. And so now I've got my shapes. If I hide my graphic, my mask is starting to come to life. It's starting to fill itself in. So watch, if I click on this and use my eyedropper and click on the shape of the image, it'll actually fill it in with the red color that I need it to be. So it's actually filling the shapes in for me. So if I click on the little nose down here, that needs to be black. If I click on the little blue triangle and click on my eyedropper, I can make them blue. So I'm just using my eyedropper. This is like chapter 8 in your book, where you use the eyedropper to sample color. And so you're starting to see what it's looking like. It's starting to come to life as a mask. And the beauty is it's vector. So we're redrawing this mask to be the appropriate color. So now I need my stroke. And your book walks you through this process. It walks you through the process. I'm just showing you in lecture form what your book is going to do step by step. And I got to move my nose to the front here. And so my mask is coming along. I got to bring my eyeballs to the front, it looks like. The mask looks pretty good. The mask looks pretty good. So we use the ellipse tool, we used the pen tool, and we used just the ellipse and the pen tool. That's it. So we made our eyeballs and our mouth with the ellipse tool, and we made all the other shapes with the pen tool. Pretty good, I think. And we're going to do the same thing with the oars. We're going to do the same thing with the oars. So there's our mask, right? There's our mask. I actually want to make, you know, that this area that is white is actually transparent because there's no fill in our mask. Our mask doesn't have a fill, so that's white. That is the artboard, but it's actually transparent. I want to make that white so when I draw the oar across it, you don't see the oar inside of the mask. So I'm going to make the mask white. And you could do it as an individual. So here is my mask. So now we have to do each oar. So we're going to draw each oar, but I want to make it a whole shape. So when I outline this paddle, I want to use my pen tool and outline the whole paddle. So you're going to notice I'm going to start at the top of this oar, and I'm going to click my mouse, and I'm going to move diagonally and click and drag to make the curve. Then I'm going to go back and remove the forward anchor, click my mouse once. And this is the pen tool in your book. So your book is going to do the exact same thing for practice. I'm going to curve the line and I'm going to move it all the way down to the end of the handle. So remove the forward anchor, go back and create the next curve, remove the anchor. And so I'm doing the exact same thing your book practices in the chapter. I'm just doing it to our own unique logo. And so now your oar shape should look like that as an outline. And remember, I'm recording this, so you can watch this over and over again if you wanted to. And so I'm going to create the next oar also. So I'm just doing silhouettes or outlines of each oar. I love how they use the vintage oars for their logo. That part of it is pretty cool. I think they paid an artist to like paint this. This feels like And so I have each of my silhouettes created now. So my mask is colored in and each of my silhouettes are created. So there they are for each paddle shape. But I do need to send each paddle to back because I drew them over top of my mask. I'm going to click on each one and send it to back. And so now you can see the mask over top of my oars, right? There's the original image. And these are just individual shapes, right? And they're actually, you can see them right here. They're at the bottom of my vector layer. So all I did was draw them over top of it. So it looked like this, because this is the image. And I just sent it to back. Arrange, send to back. Now, one thing I do like to do is when I create a finished shape or finished like part of my illustration, I like to group that part. So watch if I take my mouse and I just use my selection arrow and I draw a selection box over the top of it. You're going to notice I actually selected the mask and the oars. If I hold down Shift, I can deselect that shape, hold down Shift, deselect that shape, and I only have the mask selected. I like to do object group. And the reason I do object group is because now that's all one thing. So once I've drawn it, I like to group it so it's all one thing. So now you can see this mask is separate from the oars. This mask is separate from the oars. And the reason I want to do that is because I actually want to make the mask bigger, right? I want to make the mask bigger. So you see how small it was? I made it bigger. I want it to be more substantial, as it more like the skull and crossbones of the poison symbol and less like really dainty little things. So you can see I made the mask bigger. Now for the oars, I just have to use the eyedropper. So let's sample the wood. Let's make it one of the little bit darker colors. So there it is. Let's sample this oar. Make it one of the darker colors. And so now you can see that I've created the oars. Now, let me undo it real quick. I probably should create these two little graphics on the oars because once I fill them in, I can't see the pictures behind them. So as part of the outline, I think I need to make these little graphics. Now this is just a burst shape. So I'm going to click that. I'm going to deselect, and then I'm going to use my pen tool and do doot, doot. And I'm going to deselect, and then I'm going to do doot, doot, and deselect. And I'm literally just going to create the burst. That is this thing. Deselect, go to the next line, deselect, go to the next line. Now, when we get into a little bit more advanced drawing in the next Illustrator class, we get into gradients and some like fancy textures and things. But for the sake of graphic design too, we're just learning the basic tools. So there's the little graphic I put on the end of the oar. And the last one is this weird looking frog thing. And so I'm just going to draw a simple shape around it. So just draw the hand, remove the forward anchor, draw the next part of the hand, remove the forward anchor. And you're going to notice I'm doing the exact same thing I'm talking to you guys about doing. I'm just drawing simple shapes. Next is this little hand, and it looks like it maybe has a couple of fingers, maybe. It looks like a little frog or something. Hard to tell exactly what it is. And so I'm just creating the little shape. It looks like he's got little like frog legs or something. Not the prettiest shape, but it'll get the job done because it looks like a little frog guy of some kind. And so he actually has to be filled in because he's a shape. And so now I can color in my oars because I have the little graphics that I created on the oars. So I'm just using my eyedropper, and they're actually two different colors of red. And so let me zoom out here. And so there is the original graphic. And here's my little illustration I'm creating of it, just creating a vector version of it. So I do like to add a stroke to the oars just so that they have a shape. And you can make the stroke a little bit thicker if you wanted to. I like to do that too. All right, so now I have my graphic created. Not bad. If we were using gradients and some more like advanced features, we could make that a little bit more 3D. But for graphic design 2, where we're just doing the basic elements of drawing with the pen tool, not too bad. Now, that brings us to the type, right? The type. And we've got to write CGT kayaks. And you'll notice in the original logo, it said CGT kayaks and the symbol was over here. It's actually better if you put the symbol here and either put CGT above it and kayaks below it, or you can do CGT kayaks underneath it, which we call stacking the text. So either way will work. CGT up here, kayaks down here. We could write CGT kayaks up the top and Bonita Springs, Florida underneath it. I never recommend putting your phone number in a logo because your phone number could change. Not sure why they did that, but we're going to just use the text tool and kind of create the text for it. I think we should put CGT above and maybe kayaks below. So let's use the text tool, and we're just going to click our mouse and type in CGT. So there it is, CGT. Now, in Illustrator, the next chapter in your book is all about text. So let's just open up the text palette. And your book does this. You're going to follow along with your book, and we're just going to make the text bigger. Keep going. Now remember, we want the size of the text to equal visually the size of the symbol. So if we're not using bold text, these letters have to be pretty big to kind of equal the weight of the symbol. So I'm going to start with regular text just so I can figure out like what I want to do. So let's go over to the character palette. And if you type it in, look at how it shows you next to the font. So we just got to pick a cool font. So Stencil isn't a cool font. So let's see if we can find something a little bit better. This Bodoni is cool, but I don't know if a serif typeface is best. Here's a handwriting. Kind of interesting. Chalkboard. Caslon. I actually really like Caslon as a typeface. It's from many, 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 many moons ago. One of the original 7 typefaces. This is cool. I don't know. What says early 1900s Bonita Springs? There are so many typefaces. Let's go with Hoffler. We're going to give Hoffler a try because that is one of the original typefaces. So I'm just going to drop that text in there so we get the basic idea of it. And then I have to use the text tool again because I have to type in kayaks. There's a cap lock. Now you may notice that the word kayaks, I'm actually going to hide the graphic. The word kayaks is bigger than the letter CGT. We actually need to make the word kayak smaller. so that it makes more of a square graphic, right? So if I was visualizing, and I'm only doing this for visualization, this is not for the logo. We need to make it square. Our attempt is to make this thing square-like, so we can minimize negative space. So you can see that this is pretty compact because we made the word kayaks kind of equal, close to equal to the width of the paddles. We probably could even go a little bit smaller because we want this thing to be about the width of the symbol. So that paddle kind of goes kind of down that way. This paddle kind of goes down that way, so that we make this thing square. And you're actually going to notice I'm making the text close to the symbol so that there isn't a lot of negative space. Like this is minimal negative space. This is more negative space because of the way the shield mask doesn't go all the way down to the, in essence, the height of the paddle. I could make this a little bit bigger. Then there isn't as much negative space. I'm going to delete this because this was only for visual purposes. And so now you can see the original illustration painting and my new vector version of it. I didn't have to know how to draw. I traced these two paddles. I didn't even know how to create the symbols. I just traced them based on what was painted. All I did was make shapes based on what the image is. So I didn't have to have any ability to draw whatsoever. I was just creating the shapes based on the photograph of the shapes, meaning that this graphic template is just good for scale and proportion, of which I changed a bunch of the scale and proportion. So now I have a scalable graphic, but the beauty is, look at this thing. It works like that. And it works like that. It's completely scalable. Your chapter assignments are how to use the basic pen tool to do a little bit better drawing shapes, how to fill shapes in with the eyedropper, which is what I did, and how to use the text tool to add text to your illustration. Now, the last step of the process in your book for text is to make the text a shape once you type the words out. So once you type the words out and they're exactly the way you want them, the last step of text in a graphic in Illustrator is to make it an outline. So your book shows you how to do create outline. So you see how this is now a shape? It's as if that type was drawn with the pen tool. See all the nodes? Look at the difference down here. There's a line down here, which means it's a font. It's a typeface. Once you outline it, it becomes a shape. The negative with outlining it is you can't use the text tool if you have a typo. Once you make it an outline, it's as if that was drawn with the pen tool. And in the olden days, sometimes artists would draw letters with the pen tool. Now we have a million typefaces, so we don't have to draw letters with the pen tool anymore. But it's important to outline the type after you put the type in your Illustrator design, because anyone that opens this file doesn't need to have the typeface. If you outline the type, anyone that opens the file doesn't need Hoffler. If you don't outline the type, anyone that opens this file needs Hoffler. And if they don't, it will be replaced with another typeface. And replacing it with another typeface isn't good because it'll make it look different if it opens up on a typeface that the other computer doesn't have. So by outlining your type, it makes it as if it was drawn, just like the paddle or any of these elements. So watch if I draw the selection box over the whole thing. Everything is made of nodes. Literally, everything is made of nodes. That's the key to Illustrator. that when you draw something, whether you're tracing a photograph, whether you're typing words in, is that you make them shapes. These shapes are really important because you can make it as small as a stamp. It actually looks really good, tiny, tiny. Or as big as a billboard. That's the key to Illustrator. So your book has you practice the pen tool, practice the eyedrop tool, and practice the text tool. The same thing we did recreating this logo. The only difference is we redrew this thing. Now, if we were in advanced Illustrator, which is our next class that we call visual communication, we would go in here and we would actually create gradients inside of this thing, this shape. We would make this light to dark, and you can actually see them in the swatches area. We can actually make it light to dark. And so here's our gradient. So I'm going to pick the gradient just so that you can see this thing. I'm going to pull it away for a minute. Right, we can make this a lot more three-dimensional using things like gradients. We can add textures. Like we could really jazz this thing up with advanced Illustrator techniques. We're just doing basic shapes right now to get more comfortable with the pen tool and some of the processes of vector drawing. But in essence, we created our first little scalable logo. And I actually like to, when I'm creating some version of logo for a client, is I like to show them how it works really big and really small. And so all we did was use a photograph as inspiration and created our own little vector logo. So this is the chapters in your book. All we did was practice the pen tool, chapter 7, the eyedropper tool with the fills, chapter 8, the text tool and the shape tool, chapter 10 and 11. That's it. We just did it in a logo recreation process for our lecture. So we did about an hour and 50-minute lecture or so. So I want to end the lecture now so it gives students a little easier time to ingest you can watch this thing over and over again. I'm going to post it in the announcement section. Just remember that if you choose for your chapter assignments for the Illustrator Learning Module 2 to not use the Illustrator files from the book and you want to create your own illustrations, just make sure you show the text tool, the pen tool, the shape tools, the things that are in the chapters inside of your submissions. Don't give me just text or give me just an outline of something or just fill a shape in. Like make sure that you're showing each of the skills that we're using in our basic Illustrator chapters. And I look forward to seeing what you come up with. I'm going to end the streaming part of the lecture now so that I can post the recording inside the announcement section. If you logged in a little bit later, you didn't catch it all, or you were in class and you want to watch it again, I'm going to post the recording. It's about an hour and 45 minutes for recreating this little logo project that we've recreated. But I look forward to seeing your projects for Learning Module 2 this week. Next week, we'll do a very basic multi-page InDesign project so we can kind of enhance our multi-page skills using Adobe InDesign. Everyone have a great week. You've done really well in Learning Module 1, so let's keep up the good process for Learning Module 2. I've got a little chat here, so I'm going to just